Guys, wir gucken kurz rein in ein Video. Ich glaube, das ist sehr sinnvoll, diese Nachricht so ein bisschen zu verbreiten. Zum Thema rote Karte, ne? Also für alle, die jetzt neu eingeschaltet haben, es geht um die rote Karte, eine Item, was quasi schon seit Tag 1 im Pokémon Pocket drin ist, die sich, die macht, dass der Gegner die komplette Hand ins Deck zurückmischen muss und ich glaube 4 neue Karten ziehen darf oder so. Und die kann, wenn richtig eingesetzt, game-changing sein, weil du dem Gegner seine wichtigsten Karten wegfetzt. In diesem Video geht es aber darum, warum diese Karte eine tote Karte ist, beziehungsweise eine sehr schlechte Karte und sich in aller Regel nicht auszahlt und nicht lohnt. Okay, warte mal, gucken wir mal. Aha. Da ist wieder das. So.
Today, I would like to take a little bit of time to talk about the card Red Card in Pokemon Pocket. This is an effect that sees regular play and is often in the top performing lists in Pokemon Pocket tournaments, but despite these performance metrics, I think Red Card is actually quite bad, and your decks are almost always better off playing a different utility card in its slot. Let's go ahead and dive into some of the details of the actual numbers that happen when you're playing Red Card to examine both some specific scenarios and some more general cases and show mathematically why I've come to the conclusion I have. When playing Red Card, there are 4 different possible outcomes.
Also, seine Theorie ist, dass die rote Karte rein mathematisch gesehen für euer Deck nichts macht. Im Gegenteil sogar noch dem Gegner helfen kann. Und er hat das Ganze mal ausgerechnet und präsentiert jetzt quasi hier das, was er rausgefunden hat.
Comes for your opponent. The first 2 are completely neutral. They are your opponent didn't have the card that you care about, and they still don't have it after you red card them. The second one is they had it when you red carded them, and they still have it afterwards because they redrew it. The third is actively detrimental to you, the red card player. They didn't have the card and you've given it to them. And the fourth one is the one you really want to happen as much as possible. They had the card that you care about and you've...
So, das ist basically eigentlich auch schon zusammenfassend alles, was man dazu sagen kann. Die rote Karte hat 4 optionale Outcomes. 3 davon sind useless oder sogar schlecht. Also, ne, 2 davon sind einfach useless, dann ist Red Card einfach eine tote Karte und zwar der Gegner hat die Karte, die er braucht und du Red Cardest ihn und danach zieht er sie wieder, das heißt er bekommt sie wieder. Das andere Outcome ist, der Gegner hat die Karte nicht, die er braucht und du Red Cardest ihn und er hat sie immer noch nicht, das heißt 2 von 4 Outcomes sind einfach useless, die sind tot. Dann hast du ein Outcome, der sogar schlecht ist für dich. Also, dass der Gegner die Karte davor nicht hatte, die er braucht. Und jetzt hat er sie dadurch, dass du ihn geredcardet hast. Damit verschaffst du ihm einen Vorteil. Und die letzte Option ist, dass er die Karte tatsächlich hatte und jetzt nicht mehr hatte. Aber 3:1 ist halt eher so meh, ne? Eine gute, eine schlechte und 2 useless. Das ist halt rein mathematisch gesehen, wenn man sich so überlegt, echt nicht so smart, ne?
Taken it away from them by playing Red Card. Let's take a look at our first example scenario, one that I hear get referenced a ton in favor of playing Red Card. This is, your opponent is working towards a Stage 2 Pokemon, and they've played out their Stage 1, so you want to red card them now to try and get rid of that Stage 2 that's being held in their hand. In the given scenario, let's say our opponent has played out 2 basic Pokemon, they've evolved into that Stage 1, they played a Pokeball to find one of those basics, they played an X-Speed at some point, and they played a Professor's Research, so their hand is nice and big. This means our opponents played out 6 cards in total that aren't in their deck or their hand, meaning there's 14 cards left in the opponent's deck when we red card them and they're redrawing. Let's look at our 4 possible outcomes in this scenario. There's a 10% chance your opponent was missing their Stage 2 and they're still missing it. there's a 47% chance your opponent had it to begin with and still has it now. There's a 20% chance they didn't have it and you gave it to them. And there's a 23% chance that the favorable outcome happened, they had it to begin with, and your red card has taken away the stage 2 that they were looking to evolve into. More generally, this means red card in our scenario did nothing 57% of the time. It was a boost to your opponent 20% of the time, and it did what you were looking to do, hurt your opponent's consistency only 23% of the time.
Das ist das, was ich vorhin meinte, ne? Also über die Hälfte macht es einfach gar nichts. 20% hilft man dem Gegner und 23% ist es actually useful. Wenn man jetzt aber die 20% noch zusätzlich zu den 57% rechnet, was ja kein positives Outcome für dich ist, dann sind wir halt bei 77%, wo diese Karte nichts oder was Schlechtes macht. Ne? 23%, dass es wirklich nützlich ist halt sehr, sehr, sehr schlecht, wenn man in Betracht zieht, dass man eine andere Karte spielen könnte, die einem tatsächlich hilft. Ne? Sowas wie ein Trank oder so. Ich meine, da gibt's nicht viel Gamba. Ne? Ein Trank ist ein Trank. So gesehen.
In this given scenario, this means 3 out of 4 times you play red card, it's going to have no effect or an actively detrimental effect on you trying to beat your opponent. Next, let's take a look at another common scenario where red card is touted as being useful and disruptive. You lose the game if your opponent has a specific supporter card that's a one of in their deck. They can have a Sabrina to fish up a bench Pokemon, or they have a Giovanni to hit a breakpoint and end the game on the spot. For the sake of this example, I'm going to assume the game's been going on for a little while and there's 10 cards left in your opponent's deck, i.e. they've drawn half their cards and they have 3 cards in their hand, meaning we're drawing from a total of 13 cards after your opponent gets red carded. The 4 possible outcomes in this scenario are a 35% chance that your opponent didn't have the supporter card to begin with and they still don't have it after the red card. There's a 15% chance that they had it and they still have it after you red card them. There's a 15% chance that your opponent didn't have it and they now have it, meaning you helped them. And there's a 35% chance that they had it and now you've taken it away from them. In this particular example, that means that there is a 50% chance your red card was functionally useless. It didn't change the outcome of whether or not your opponent had or didn't have their card. There's a 15% chance that your red card actively helped your opponent. And there's a 35% chance that your red card was beneficial and took the card that they needed away from them. This means when it comes to trying to deny your opponent having a specific supporter that wins them the game, about 2/3 of the time, red card is going to have no impact or an actively detrimental impact, and around 1/3 of the time, it actually does what you're aiming to do, which is take away that game-winning card from your opponent. Something to note about both these specific examples we started with here is they require making some assumptions about how many cards the opponent has seen out of their deck and how many cards they've played out onto the board. Red card is an effect that the more total cards your opponent has played out into play or have ended up in the discard pile gets worse and worse. The fewer cards your opponent has remaining in their deck when they're redrawing post-red card, the more.
Und das macht die Karte noch schlechter, ne? Also je später man die rote Karte im Spiel zieht, desto weniger wert wird die. Und schon in der ersten Runde ist die basically 2/3 bis 3/4 nichts wert, right?
Likely they are to hate the card again that you hope they aren't going to have after you take it away from them. These details being variable leads me to this table, which I think does a good job of illustrating the point I am trying to make about just how regularly red card is going to do almost nothing. where our first column in this table is the total number of cards in the opponent's deck plus hand that they're going to be redrawing from. The second column is the odds they redraw the card if they had it to begin with, given that there's only one copy in their deck. The second column is the odds to redraw one of those cards given they have 2 copies in their deck. The number that I think is especially worth pointing out here is that if your opponent has 14 cards left in their deck, a very common number in the mid game once you've burned an X speed and a Pokeball and a research, there's already a over 50% chance that your opponent redraws whatever you took away from them that you didn't want to have with a red card. I feel I would be remiss to stop this table with just these 3 columns though, because another important facet of playing with red card is that it can give your opponent more than just the card that they care about. More specifically, you can often red card your opponent into their copies of Professor's Research. If we add 2 more columns to this table, the odds to redraw the card that they care about that has 2 copies or 1 research, we get this third column. And should your opponent...
Stimmt, das habe ich noch nie mal mit eingerechnet, ne? Dass du basically, er hat Eich, wenn er Eich hat, spielt er Eich. Wenn er Eich nicht hat und du Red Card ist, dann kannst du ihm einen Eich geben, was basically 2 Karten worth ist.
Opponent have 2 copies of research in their deck along with the 2 cards that they care about. We get this fourth column is a scenario that's going to be very common in Pokemon Pocket, and I think it's ultimately the one that makes the best case against red card. Even if your opponent has 17 cards in their deck and hand, and you assume you're taking away a card that they care about out of their hand, there is a 70% chance your opponent is either going to redraw that card or one of their 2 copies of Professor's Research. And the other thing to consider in the scenario, you're saying, Jeff, well, what if my opponent's already played one of their copies of Research out, or even both of them? Sure, that lowers the odds and removes these third and fourth column from being applicable, but if your opponent has played 2 copies of Research, there's a higher chance of the total number of cards in their deck and hand remaining being smaller. If they saw 4 extra cards before you red carded them, they probably played out more basics, they played out a potion, they played out an X speed, they played out a Tempo Sabrina in there somewhere, meaning in these first 2 columns, we're looking at the lower rolls in the table now as opposed to the higher ones because your opponent burned through more cards in their deck, leaving their deck even smaller, giving them an even higher probability chance that your red card is going to do functionally nothing, taking away a card and giving that same card back to them. And I think this point is ultimately one of the most important to hammer across when talking about this topic. Decks in Pokemon Pocket are not large to begin with. They're only 20 cards. And as the game goes on, especially in longer games, those decks and hands get progressively smaller, and the pool of cards your opponent is redrawing from gets smaller and smaller, meaning they are more likely to get back whatever you're trying to take away from them. And this is where I think the big disconnect is when evaluating red card for experienced TCG veterans. Pokemon Pocket is not like traditional Pokemon TCG or Magic the Gathering or a variety of other paper card games that have large deck sizes. A red card effect in paper Pokemon would be really good because the odds that your opponent's deck is small enough that they're going to redraw their key cards after you shuffle their hand away is quite low. In Pocket, where decks are a third of the size of the paper card game, this is not the case, and like our table shows, the odds of them redrawing the card that you're hoping to take away from them are actually quite high in most of the common scenarios. Something that is worth acknowledging when talking about red card is that its presence in the format, or knowing it is in your opponent's deck list in an open deck list tournament setting, does create pressure on the decisions you make throughout the course of the game. Knowing your opponent has a red card or could possibly have it often changes the decision between, do I want to play this professor's research on 1, or do I want to sit on it for a turn so I'm more likely to be able to play out the cards that I draw with it. It also encourages you to play your stage 1 evolutions out sooner rather than later for fear of getting them shuffled away. It could mean you'd want to play a potion proactively as opposed to concealing that information, and I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that that is not without value. All of that being said, I would make what I feel is the strong argument that the nominal amounts of pressure that red card creates in those situations I just listed do not make up for the number of times, 1, that is making your opponent's hand better when you play it, and 2, I definitely do not feel it makes up for the fact that putting a red card in your Pokemon Pocket deck is not free. Pocket decks being small means you have a very limited number of slots in your deck to dedicate to various utility cards. I've basically never built a Pokemon Pocket deck and looked at it and gone, man, there's nothing else I want to play in here. I always wish I had a second copy of Sabrina, or Giovanni, or the first copy of Potion, or the second copy of X-Speed. There's so many good utility trainer cards in Pokemon Pocket that get you out of sticky situations or win you the games in key spots that you rarely have room to play 2 copies of in your deck, that playing a card like red card that has a nominal impact at most in your opponent's sequencing and can be actively detrimental, giving your opponent a boost to allow them to win the game at absolutely worst, to justify playing red card over something else that's going to be situationally and consistently always good when it comes up. All in all, if I'm being honest, I don't know that I really expect this video to change hearts and minds. I think a lot of the reason people are playing red card is either because they're copy and pasting deck lists and not really thinking about the details, or they're running purely on visceral feels, and red card is a card that feels good to play quite regularly. You literally don't know when your red card is actively hurting your opponent or when they're actively helping them.
Ja, das ist ein wichtiger Punkt, ne? Selbst wenn man 6, 7, 8 Karten vom Gegner ins Deck zurückmischt, weiß man actually gar nicht, ob es geholfen hat oder nicht, ne? Weil man sieht seine Hand nicht. Es kann sein, dass es geholfen hat und dass er gerade irgendwas Krasses hätte spielen wollen. Es kann aber auch genauso sein, dass es einfach gar nichts gemacht hat. Ne? Oder sogar, dass er am Bricken war und dann einfach bessere Karten hat. Ne? Also man kann das nicht mal verifizieren. Und das ist, glaube ich, so der größte Bias an der Red Card, weil man einfach denkt, dass es viel bringt, aber man kann eigentlich gar nicht wissen, was es dann am Ende des Tages gebracht hat.
So, more often than not, it can feel better to play than it's actually going to be. I do appreciate everybody that made it all the way through to the end of the video. If you're not familiar with me, welcome. My name's Jeff Hoagland. I've been playing card games.
Ja, also ich finde ein sehr interessantes Video. Ich hatte schon den Verdacht, dass Red Card irgendwie so ein bisschen schwierig ist. Ich war der Meinung, Red Card ist so eine 50-50. Wenn du den Gegner gut erwischt, kannst du quasi das Game direkt entscheiden, und das passiert ja auch, das gibt's ja auch, ne? Mir wurde auch schon zu einem mega wichtigen Zeitpunkt irgendwas weggeredcardet und dann habe ich einfach straight verloren. Diese Matches gibt es, aber rein mathematisch ist es so unwahrscheinlich, dass du mit anderen Karten in der allermeisten Zeit eigentlich besser dran wärst. Deswegen, ne? Und dann kommt halt noch hinzu, dass du buchstäblich einfach nicht weißt, ob das gerade jetzt was gebracht hat oder nicht. Und dass man vielleicht auch die Wirkung deswegen überschätzt. Ja. Alles in allem, dieses Video hat mich definitiv überzeugt, Red Cards aus meinem Deck zu verbannen, was ich okay finde, weil dann kann man halt mehr andere Karten reinmachen, ne? Wie er schon sagt, ich meine, es gibt andere Karten, wir haben alleine heute 3 richtig gute Staples dazu bekommen, mit Leaf, Blau und der Mew-Geschichte, was nur für Mew-Decks interessant und wertvoll ist, aber ihr versteht, was ich meine. Und ja, man will halt diese Karten dann reinpacken. in das Ding, ne? Und nicht irgendeine Karte, die halt, mal was macht und mal nicht. Ne? So gesehen ist die Karte halt sogar schlechter als eine 50-50. Es ist nicht mal eine. Ich dachte so, okay, es ist eine 50-50. Manchmal wird man was gewinnen, manchmal was verlieren. Vielleicht mit einem guten Gespür, mit gutem Timing wird man eher was gewinnen. Aber die Mathematik sagt, dass es genau andersrum ist. Man gewinnt zu einem Drittel, einem Viertel was dazu und macht zur Hälfte nichts und zu einem Viertel hilft man dem Gegner. Deswegen, also lieber andere Karten spielen als rote Karte. Rein mathematisch gesehen sinnvoll, insbesondere im Pokémon TCG Pocket, wo die Decks halt nur aus 20 Karten bestehen. Ja, ich glaube, spätestens wenn Ranked rauskommt und deutlich mehr Karten verfügbar sind und das Ganze sich so ein bisschen eingegroovt hat, wird es auch so einen Standard geben, was in Decks reinkommt und was nicht, wie viele Karten davon, wie viele Karten hiervon und. Und es wird auf jeden Fall Wege geben, wie in jedem anderen TCG auch sein Deck zu optimieren. Und am Ende des Tages ist ein Kartenspiel einfach nur etwas, wo es um Optimization geht. Ne? Du willst deine Chance optimieren, die guten Karten zu ziehen, die du brauchst, und du willst deinem Gegner, wenn möglich, die Chance nehmen. Das erhöht einfach deine Chance, dass du Matches gewinnst. Und TCGs etc., gerade im Ranked, entscheidet ja nicht ein Match, sondern die Anzahl an Matches, die man spielt, ob man weiterkommt oder eben nicht. Ja, deswegen ist es am Ende des Tages eine Chancensache. Und ich habe das Video gestern gesehen und ich dachte mir, vielleicht zeige ich es euch nochmal, und jetzt ist actually eine gute Gelegenheit dafür. Ich würde euch empfehlen, schmeißt die roten Karten raus. Ja. Schmeißt die roten Karten raus und macht was anderes rein. Ich glaube, das ist definitiv sinnvoller.